So in this third part, we're going to have a very quick look at shading. I'm going to collapse this. Actually, I'm going to leave this up and change this to the node editor. And again, you'll see a lot of this stuff is fairly simple. So when you're doing this UI type workflow, or at least when I'm doing it, I like to set my environment completely to black. So I've set this to rendered very quickly. You can see we can't see anything because there's no light anywhere. Now the reason I like to do this is because we want to start shading these individual elements and we want to make sure they look really cool and they get the right effect to, they get the right effect to make sure they look interesting. Now a lot of this UI stuff, it's lighting up itself by itself. So that's why I like to set this to black so you can see exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to start with this first one actually. And this is a very simple cube. As I've shown before, the array modifiers are turned off. So we have this little wireframe around it and this little middle section. So how do you go about shading something UI like? Now, I like using emission shaders. And by emission shaders, I mean a lot of emission shaders. So if I change this to emission, you'll see the surface just lights up, and that's not really what I wanted. I want to make it look really cool, a bit more interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slot the emission into the volume slot, and as you can see, this becomes a lot more interesting to look at already. I'm going to color it just a little bit, make it green, bluish, something like that, something similar to the final file. Now the other thing you might notice is that the wireframe isn't lighting up. That's because this in comparison to the volume that it's shading with the emission is very thin, so you're gonna have to have a way higher value to actually make these edges light up ever so slightly. Now I'm going to keep this set to 1, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the material offset here, and in my material editor I'm going to grab a second material slot, add another new one, and again I'm going to hit Shift S with the Node Wrangler enabled and switch this to emission, and again set this to volume rather than surface, and now I can crank this one up separately and I can have a slightly different color for this, so you get these really nice hologram looking things. Now one thing to keep in mind is any sort of volume or surface that is emitting light is going to be fairly noisy, so you might have to crank up the render samples a little bit higher than usual to get a nice result. But that being said, if almost everything in your scene is this type of shader, it's not going to be too much of an issue, and you'll actually get a noise-free render fairly quickly. So if I were to now grab these other ones, I'm going to grab this one last, and I'm going to set it back to rendered view so you can see exactly what's happening. I'm going to hit L. What I can do is link the materials, then the other ones will grab the exact same ones. Now I need that wireframe modifier here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the array, do the same thing, make sure I select all of them, link the modifiers, and now it'll have linked the wireframe modifier with the material offset. So if I hit Shift Z, now we get these really interesting results very quickly. Now something else to note, if I go back to my plane with all these things on it, is obviously this is going to take a little bit of tweaking, but something else that I wanted to show you as well is if we're in this second material slot, when you're using particles, you're distributing these as separate objects, so you can use some really interesting shaders to get some variation in this stuff really nicely. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to input a object node, and this has a little random node. So if I were to just shift click this or shift control click this with the Node Wrangler add-on, you'll see that every one of these edges is getting a variation between black and white because it's picking them randomly and it's assigning a random color between black and white to every single object, which is really cool because that means if we use a color ramp, we can color this. So if I grab the black flag here and just drop the color that we already had, put it in there, and again I'm going to turn off the surface and just make sure it's a volume shader. What I can do is, let's say, grab some red, and if I bring these together, then you'll see you'll get a lot of really interesting variation already. Now it might be worth just tweaking the original material here and setting it to like 0.1 or maybe even stronger in this case. There we go. You get this really cool looking sort of interesting elements. Now something else that you could do while you're doing this stuff is, let's see if we add in a couple of subdivisions to this one. There we go, and we go back to our array, then you'll see you'll have these sort of almost building like looking things, and some of these extra edges really shine through. And again, you could tweak the the thickness of the wireframe, you get these really interesting looking UI elements. Now this is a little over the top, but it just goes to show you how quickly you can iterate with this kind of stuff. Now pretty much, I think about 90% of the shading in the in that final shot was done this way. We'll open it up in just a second. There's a second one that I want to talk about a little bit as well, a second technique that I like using. And I'm just going to grab this sphere. We have these little extra spheres, which again, we could, if we go into the wireframe here, we could add a material offset. But what I want to do is just use a regular emission shader in the surface slot rather than the volume slot, and show you how you can control it in a more interesting way. So if I were to change this over to an emission shader again, now it's in the surface slot, and were you to turn this down, then it just sort of turns gray, and it doesn't really look right because you want this hologram to sort of be semi-transparent. So that's exactly what I'm going to do for this one. I'm just going to grab a mix shader. I'm going to put in the emission in the bottom slot. I'm going to turn it back to 1 or maybe even 2, just sort of, actually let's turn it back to 1 and keep it simple. I'm going to change this to like an orange-ish color. So I think it's quite similar to the way I did the globe in the middle, but I'll show you in just a second. There we go. And the other shader I'm going to grab is a transparent shader. And now if we look at this and we mix the, only mix in the emission a little bit, you can see it has this really cool holographic feel, and we're just using a surface shader rather than a volume shader. So if you have these individual polygons and you're not able to use a volume shader, if I pipe it in, then it sort of gives weird results. Again, it might be interesting, but because we don't have geometry that actually has a volume, because they're actually simple, simple flat planes, surface can be easier to use and easier to manage. And if you sort of factor it in like this, you get really interesting holographic looking results very quickly. Now, if you wanted to go a little bit further with this, or approach it slightly differently, if you grab a layer weight, which I've done here, and you add a Fresnel in rather than the factor, then if you bring this down, you can get really, really interesting results again. If you wanted to control this, you could put in a math node, set it to multiply, and now you can actually have that same sort of effect with the Fresnel fall off in it. And you can experiment with this stuff and just do crazy, crazy things. Like the sky's the limit. Try and combine a lot of these things, but between this shader and the previous one that I showed you where I just slot in the emission to the volume, honestly, almost everything got shaded in that project. So with that said, let's actually look at it. And it should be in my recent files. There it is. I believe it's Tech 2. There we go. So, this is my compositing node. So again, for compositing, you know, your best friend is going to be blurs, glares, and glows. Just look at this in the file itself. I like to keep it simple when it comes to compositing. I like to try and do as much as in camera as possible, I guess you could call it. So let's have a look at the scene itself. Again, here you can see same technique was used. This is just a plane with a bunch of particles on it on this side. Same here, same idea. Also a plane subdivided with particles on each polygon. This one's slightly different, but it's also the same technique. If I'm able to select it, let's see if I can. There we go. So this one has a particle system on it as well, except instead of using the verts or faces, it's using the volume, and it's set up in a grid, which means we have all these little pixels, or at least that's what I like to call them, that are lighting up as well, and just giving an extra element of depth to everything. Now, these objects, both this larger one and the one with the particles, if we look at the shading, all they have is an emission shader on the inside, and if I hit render very quickly, what you can see is around this globe, you'll get this really cool sort of effect where it's shining through. And honestly, all that is this second, this first and second cube here combined with an emission shader, and it has this nice fall off by itself towards the edges. So you get this really interesting glow in the final result, in the final render. So if you look at a lot of these techniques, again, if you look at this sort of square thing, this is just a round cube which has been again, with an edge split and a smooth to split up the particles in between them. If you look at the world map, it's exactly the same as what I did in the second part, where I did use the use the edge split and the smooth and solidify sort of in those ways. The only difference is that we now have a mask. Let's see what this is called. World map. So if I go into the UV image editor, So I have this very simple world map. Again, this is some public domain image that I grabbed off the internet. And all it's doing is using that as the mix factor for the transparent. So I have that same shader that I set up earlier where I have the emission shader and the transparent mixing in together on the surface level to give this sort of holographic look. And again, I'm adding that same transparent and mixing that shader that we made, and mixing it with that image texture. So all that I'm doing is just grabbing that image and only letting it shine through on those parts. So if you have a look at it, you'll see that while this is, if I grab this by itself, this is a full sphere. If I hit Shift Z, you see only the parts with the world map are showing up. So this is another way of doing things simply. And what's really important to remember, again, this is just the way I approach things, is I have sort of a circular pattern for this one. Then I have a couple of just very simple curves that I created, again using the same thing with the emission and the volume. And under that one, if I'm able to select it, I have a round cube, I believe. Where is it? Yeah, so because that gives us a square pattern, I believe under that one we have, let's see, yeah, there we go. I have, it was just a, what is it? I always forget what it's called. An icosphere, and because I have all these different patterns mixing together, I get these really, really interesting results. Obviously, you can't always preview it like this in the viewport because some of them are, most of them are transparent. But again, if you look at it, this is just a box with an inset with a solidify, a subsurf, and a wireframe. This is just some triangles which I then triangulated, added a solidify, a mirror, a wireframe. So these mirrors, for example, I generally just only create one of these corners and then mirror it in the X and Y axis. And this is really important if you're doing this type of work. Make sure you start in the very middle of your scene, so you can actually, you know, mirror stuff very quickly and easily. Same with this. This is just, oh no, this is actually a collapsed down system, so it's my fault. I believe this one is mirrored. Yeah. So I've actually just created this one, then with my pivot point in the middle, so I use a 3D cursor to rotate it 90 degrees, and then I can just mirror it over and it looks fine. And just keep going and keep going and keep going. One last thing I want to say about those particles as well. This is a grid that I created. So again, if you look at it, all it is, there's two elements to this. There's three curves, which are then arrayed in 3 dimensions. So if I turn off the second array, you can see it's arrayed in the z-axis as well, and then arrayed in that axis as well, and arrayed in that axis. So don't try and figure out ways to create this stuff by hand. Just create one corner and array it from there. Same thing with these little grid markers. Same deal, just created one, and there's 3 arrays. And as long as you keep a lot of these offsets the same, and keep them, I like to keep the numbers that are easy to remember for me. So this one is like 0.5. It's really, really quick and easy to create a second set of objects with the same offsets that create this entire grid and make it look really, really interesting. So let's see. Oh yeah, one last thing that I did want to mention that I was actually about to talk about once I noticed that grid is this particle system. So in the final shot, let's see if I can open it up here very quickly. The final shot, to add a little bit extra dimension, I have all these particles going up. And again, it's just a very simple particle system, but it adds a little bit of verticality to your shot. So I have things moving in sort of the X and Y axis. If we look at it in Blender terms, if I move this up, so this is like moving up and then out, and then we have something moving down, we have these twisting around, we have the globe turning around as well, and then add on to all of that, we have the parallax of this grid, and we have all these little particles moving up. And once you break it down to its bare components, obviously I didn't just start doing this. Honestly, what I started with was I drew a circle, just a very simple circle mesh. I believe it was this one. I extruded it, I cut a hole in the middle, and that's where I started. That's it. And then I thought, okay, I had an idea. I sort of wanted to put like a world map. I wanted to have this sort of a map UI or whatever. So I put that globe in the middle, and then I just started layering different versions of it until I finally got to, I think it's like 3 or 4 or 5 layers. And that's the best way to approach this type of work. Don't think of it as this one monolithic piece of work. Think of it as all these beautiful little elements that come together. It's easier to build something up one by one than to try and do everything at once with one big element. you know, as you can see, there's quite a few objects in here, but it's not the end of the world. Like, it's not that many. I tried to name as many of them. I sort of gave up towards the end because I was on a roll and I was doing stuff. But just to show you very quickly, when you're creating these different elements, I like putting numbers in front of them. Like, everything that is 0 has to do with the meshes for the globe, so it's all those curves and stuff. Then there's one which is the grid, and all these basically grids at the bottom, and maybe I can talk about those very quickly as well. So I have this base mesh, and I think this is one of the few ones where I actually use the texture. So you've seen the first technique video. I talk a little bit about, oh, okay, we won't actually be able to see anything. Maybe if I set this to texture, maybe, there we go. So I talked about just doing a very quick UV unwrap and using these sort of technical looking things, technical looking public domain textures for as a bump map, so you can get these really intricate results. So this is the very, very base layer of it. And if I move up to the second one, there's a second grid mesh, which is, if I hit Shift C, we still can't see anything. And why is that? Oh yeah, we can't see anything. So I'm just going to turn this up a little bit. So this is, again, I believe, 2 brick textures mixed together. You can have a look at the individual shader yourself, but just at a very, very low setting. So I don't know if this will be visible in the recording, but you can barely see it. And I like adding a lot of these little extra elements, and I just cut a hole for the globe so it doesn't interfere with it. Just very, very simple elements that you keep layering and keep layering. So this is semi-transparent, which means it will look nice when combined with the other stuff. Then let's see at the second grid. So just a regular grid, and you know, these are really not in the camera view, so I'm not too worried about them. This is another great trick actually, which I forgot to mention, is the decimate modifier can make some really interesting results. If you collapse it down, every odd number of iterations actually tries to unsubdivide it if you set it to unsubdivide, which is fairly obvious, but creates these really cool looking cross-section patterns, sort of diagonal patterns, where if you look at just the mesh itself, it's straight. So every uneven number, so on 1 and 3, you get these nice diagonal patterns, which is cool. I believe this one was set to 2. This is when I get a little lazy and I just duplicate the same object and start throwing on modifiers just to get really quick results. If we look at the other one, if we look at mesh 2, let's see, this is another grid which is a little bit finer, I believe. If you look at grid 3, this one is the part of the object around the globe here. So this is a little triangulate thing I was talking about. Again, just cut some triangles, hit the triangulate. If you want interesting results, it's a good modifier for having sort of triangle patterns and things. Then grid 4, again, is just that, what is it, that unsubdivided decimate, which gives that nice diagonal pattern. So we can go back, grid 5, this is just a, what is it, with the edge split and the smooth, so this is just split polygons. And as you can see, I just kept layering on detail, 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 and this final one is just very simple, the particle system with the little things on it, the little towers or whatever you want to call them. They look pretty cool. Then what else do I have? I have some curves around here that I just arrayed. Let's see, more curves. So if you look at these curves, what I did was just grab the first one, scale it out, and then just turn the array down for each one so you have less and less and less. And here I can even spot a little mistake. I forgot to turn down the array on the last one, so there you go. But then again, I doubt anybody even saw that in the render. So this is just to add a little bit of extra elements, and these little things, they really seat the globe in sort of the surface, and it makes it look like it's sort of being held up or projected in some way. And you can just keep going. I had some octagonal stuff in here as well. And like I said, it's all just a case of adding elements, and do it one by one. Don't get frustrated by trying to add everything in all at once. Just have a very quick look at you know, all these different elements, grab a bunch of references, look at some of the elements that you really like, and just go from there and see if you can recreate some. And you know, the cool thing about working with these modifiers is that you create a lot of sort of happy accidents, and I like that because I might put on the wrong modifier, or I might click next to the one that I want, and suddenly you get this really interesting result, and you know, you can just remember that, and yeah, and it might be a new technique, something you might use in future projects. So let's see what else we have here. So we have these cubes with the particles. We have, what is this? Oh, this is the cube with the other particles. These just have been modeled very simply, and when I was modeling these, I took out the edges here, so when the wireframe pops up, you see you don't have that edge running across. Yes, it's an n-gon, but it's not animated, so it really doesn't matter. And in this case, like, if it looks good, then that's fine. Also, we have the cube in the middle, and I can keep going. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff to this, a lot of little elements, but like I said, it's important to remember, I didn't go into this saying, all right, I want exactly this or I want exactly that. I let it evolve naturally, and I looked at some of the UIs that I think are, you know, have been made for movies that I think are really, really cool, and sort of went from there. So that's it for this technique. I wanted to put in a little bit more time on this one because I think this is something that a lot of people will be interested in. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.